Okay, this is the last section of the economics exam. We're looking at the economics exam series, section C. In section C, we're looking at you have to do 2 questions out of 4. You get 90 minutes, so it's 45 minutes per question. Each question has been divided up into criterion 3 and criterion 4. So there's 3 questions for criterion 3. That's what this part up here is referring to. And later on I'm going to talk to you about criterion 4, the economic solutions, which looks at parts D, E and F. Roughly each question, each part should be roughly about 8 minutes per part, just under a half page of writing. I would expect there to get an A answer. Alright. Now, coming back to the types of questions here, you're going to have 2 questions from Introduction to Economic Management, and you will get 2 questions from the global economy. So obviously you only have to choose one from the first part and one from the second. A lot of questions that are presented to you. So they're going to be presented in a in a newspaper article format. You have to read that and then make some interpretation from it. So if you're viewing this video, I would have the 2016 and 17 exams in front of you to follow with me what I'm doing in relation to the questions. So that's a board guideline about that. Now, in section C, you got to do, as I said, it relates to part A, B, and C. And I think I've said most of these things. But in terms of the types of things that you could be asked about for the things that you have to analyse for the economic problems, can be any of these things. So it can be explain issues, assess the causes, assess impacts on individuals, businesses and governments, assess impacts in terms of social justice, inequalities and environment, and also assess the impacts in terms of practical limitations. So it can come from any one of those parts, or those factors there, if you like. So what I'll do, I'll keep moving along. So in relation to explaining events and issues, they relate to the economic objectives: economic growth, full employment, stable prices, income distribution and environmental sustainability. So they're the objectives. So if you've got a problem with any of those, like these here, that is the problem that you will need to address. So explain those events in more detail. So try as much as possible to relate these relate the events or the problems to other economic concepts and issues wherever you can. And as always, if you're talking about, say for example, a price in a market, or if you're talking about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, anything like that, try to use diagrams as well. It's really important that you include that to demonstrate as much understanding as possible. This next section is one that's I think going to be the most popular and most obvious element to analyse, looking at the problems of various economic problems. So if you're looking at impacts on individuals, so these are sorts of things that could be asked. For example, the level of income, the employment, how much spending they've got, what opportunity cost decisions they have to make, the ability to save, and importantly, the increased standard of living. So that they're the impacts upon individuals. On businesses, so obviously they're trying to maximise profits by having increased level of sales and keeping costs under control. They do provide more employment if they've got more work to do. The most important part of any business is to increase their productive capacity, which leads to the productive capacity of the whole economy. And they also have to make spending decisions, obviously, and so they have to forego things in order to make business decisions, to especially to expand their business, and the ability to borrow in relation to interest rates and other favourable conditions is really important. Ignore that. In relation to assessing impacts on governments, in terms of the impacts on governments, they're obviously going to be looking at taxes. So the higher the economic activity, the more taxes they get. They need to obviously provide services that provide subsidies, make spending decisions and transfer payments to the welfare sector. They provide more training and employment opportunities. They spend lots of infrastructure, and obviously they also have lots of opportunity costs, and it's easy to say, well, you should spend more on this, but quite often the government will say, well, do you want us to increase taxes or take spending away from another area of spending? And quite often they impose regulations to regulate some desirable behaviour in terms of providing incentives, or disincentives in terms of regulating undesirable behaviour. In terms of the costs and inequality, here I've given you a chapter reference in your text. You should be all over that to be able to talk about some of these in relation to the answers that you have to give. So this is just a big long list that you could choose. Some of them are obviously going to be more suitable in the context of the question that you're answering, but here is a big long list that I've actually extracted from chapter 11.5, so that they should be all familiar to you. So reduced satisfaction of life outcomes, reduced economic growth, lower MPC, poverty is an obvious one, homelessness and social problems. There's increased welfare support, and sometimes there's not, which causes extra poverty. We've got social class divisions, and from that we've got more underemployment, cost of living pressures, lower educational attainment, and in some instances increased crime. So they're all the things that you can talk about the impacts of inequalities. There are some benefits that you can talk about also, and the question might be cost and benefit, so you've got to be careful about that, not only to focus on the negatives. So if people are in impoverished situation, or if they've lost their jobs, then it will give them extra incentive to retrain. It may make some people work harder in order to retain their job. It may also force people to move to where the jobs are, so therefore it encourages the labour force to be more mobile, to go to where the jobs are. It may also encourage entrepreneurs to accept more risks and to start businesses if they can't find their own work. Higher incomes individuals are more likely to save, and they're the ones that are able to provide funds for business to invest. So while that still acknowledges that the gap between rich and poor has increased, it still has that advantage from a textbook perspective. Talking about environmental impacts, again I've given you a chapter reference here of 12.5. So most of these are fairly common and easy to understand. I'm not going to spend too much time here. So we've got decreased natural environments in relation to forestry, in relation to farming and those sorts of things, and mining. We then deplete our natural resources, and that can be an impact environmentally. In terms of our taking up natural environments and extracting natural minerals, we've got lots of pollution in terms of extracting them, transporting them, manufacturing them to something else. That leads to a lot of pollution. which obviously also leads to climate change. In terms of limitations of economic policy, that's in chapter 18.2 that you can access. Here's a big long list. The main headings that you should consider is time lags. It takes a long time for some of these policies to take effect, especially talking about monetary policy. That can be between 9 and 18 months. Microeconomic reform can take years. And infrastructure spending, if we're going to address the traffic problems in Melbourne and Sydney, and they're going to say, okay, we're going to build a new train line or whatever the case may be, that can also be a matter of a number of years, sometimes up to 10 or more. Political constraints. Politicians make economic decisions. Sometimes they lack the political will because they're worried about their own jobs. That can be a problem, especially in relation to the short election cycle that we have in Australia. It's only 3 years, and currently the Senate is not controlled by the federal government, the governing party, which makes it harder to pass legislation in both houses. So the hostile Senate can hold up economic reform, or does lead to numerous compromises, which sometimes can downplay or downgrade a certain policy that the government wants to impose. We've got global influences, the world economy. There I'll mention Trump and tariffs again, and world events like economic shocks. So it can be a crisis, or could be a conflict in the Middle East or some such thing. And of course we've also always got resource constraints. We've only got so many people, we've only got so many raw materials and capital, so sometimes they're lacking, and especially in the case of if some resources are depleted or in lower supply. So here I've got a question from 2017. Now the exam specs have changed from 2017 to this current model. So this particular question I've taken, and I've chosen to take these 3 parts from it. So there are originally 6 parts in this question, and I've picked 3 of those. It could be any of those. This is the unpredictability of where we're going with this, but this is my attempt to at least give you some guide of how it might look. I could be totally wrong, I admit that, but at least I've made an attempt what it could look like. So there's 3 questions here that have come from the exam, and what I've done for the next part is going to provide answers, and they're pretty spot on because they've come from the exam report. So using examples from the extract, explain the impact of current rates of inflation on the material living of low income earners in Australia. So it talked about the fact that luxury goods went down in price, and essential goods, for example rent, utilities in terms of water and power, have gone up, and they're going to impact lower income earners more because if there's an increase in spend in a power bill of $100, that is a proportion of an income from a lower income earner is a bigger proportion as opposed to one that a person that earns more money. So it really hits the people at the lower ends a lot more through these increased prices of these essential services. Explain the benefits to individuals and business of a stable low inflation rate. So that's just something straight out of the textbook, and you'll find this a lot, that this question will be about inflation. You'll have to draw on some of the elements in that question, but sometimes I will ask you more of a generic question, if you like, to test your knowledge in relation to the context of the question. Right? So the benefits for individuals in this instance will be they maintain the purchasing power, they're more confident about spending, and lower inflation usually means lower interest rates. So that means mortgage payments will be less, they may be more willing to take out other loans, and so on. For the businesses, they will experience lower wage demands. They will have more investment confidence, mainly due to the lower interest rate payments, and therefore also then be able to offer products and services at a lower cost to our foreign customers. So international competitiveness would then be increased. This question, we're looking at an extract. Electricity has shot up. Hold on. Down here. Here we go. The electricity has shot up to 114%. Gas prices and medical services also gone up 84%. So you'd have to say that they are essential goods and services that everybody needs to have and have access to. So you've got to analyse the level of price rises on these sectors in terms of social justice and environmental. So it's a fairly big question, but it's a good one to revise for. So in terms of social justice, the lower income earners, the standard of living impacted more. And as I said before, they take a bigger proportion of their incomes, and they are regressive in nature. So when regressive means it hurts the lower income people more than it does for the high income people. So it impacts disproportionately on families and young children as with young children as well, because you could argue that young kids and elderly need to be kept in a warm and safe environment. Therefore, they will probably use more energy for those purposes. But also, it would increase your health costs. Obviously, when you're older, you need more health care, and young children, they tend to use a lot of, or demand a lot of health attention as well in their younger years. So these people would be more affected. And at the margins, it may lead people to avoid medical attention. So if you can't afford it, they don't go to the doctor, and therefore that will snowball in other problems as well. From an environmental point of view, this can probably be a positive thing, although if you have to lose, if energy is more expensive, and therefore you will use less energy, but if people are cold, it might lead to more sickness. But on the converse side, it might be a plus for the environment as less energy is being used. The other side of the coin too is that people with high incomes, they can actually afford solar panels and can decrease their energy usage. So you could use this argument to say that people in high incomes actually benefit because they can afford it, and people in low incomes, they can't actually impose any strategies or use any strategies to reduce an energy usage in any practical way because they can't afford it. Now, in relation to section C, parts D, E and F, we're looking at criterion 4. Again, it's you got to do this twice in 2 questions. One question's come from the first part, or first 2 parts of the course, and the second question comes from the global economy. The requirements are exactly the same, but 8 minutes apart, about half a page of writing per part. So the sorts of things that you could be asked to comment about is very much the same as for criterion 3. In some, I don't think you'll be able to, this is actually in the standard, but you won't have to do that because it's combined with in parts A, B and C where you're looking at a problem, but you might have to look at describing solutions, assessing the impacts of that solution, and a criteria to assess that solution, and that is usually related to looking at the economic objectives, assess the solution in terms of impacts upon social justice, environment and practical limitations. So you can see there's much similarity in these questions to criterion 3 as well. Now it is my guess that you may be asked about the social justice for criterion 4 but not criterion 3 in one question. Okay, they won't double up. And similarly, if assessing impacts, it won't be on individuals in both for criterion 3 and 4. So they might say, okay, what's the impacts on the individuals in criterion 3, the problem, and then when they impose a solution, it might benefit or not benefit businesses, for example. So that's how I suspect that the questions will be constructed. So in terms of solutions, what possible solution could be suggested? So we've got the three types of policy measures: monetary policy in terms of interest rates, microeconomic policy, and that's relatively broad. So there might be some deregulation or regulation, competition policy to make firms more competitive. Governments have in the past privatised government enterprises to the private sector, and then also might be imposing trade agreements between countries which will make our economy work more effectively. In terms of fiscal policy, we can change taxes, expenditure, and give subsidies. So there's a whole range of things that can be done there. Assessing impacts. So this is very much the same as you saw for criterion 3. And other point I'd make is that where possible also look at cost and benefits. So this is probably more prevalent in looking at economic solutions. You're going to impose a solution to hopefully for identify benefits, okay, to benefit the society in terms of solving a problem. So in this context, looking at benefits would be more appropriate for criterion 4. The criteria to assess solutions, well, our economic objectives are economic growth, full employment, stable pricing, fair income distribution, and environmental sustainability. So that's the yardstick that we use. I must say that I haven't, over the last 3 years, seen a question relating to this, but it's certainly fair game. In terms of the social justice, that's very much the same as I've already covered for criterion 3, so I'm not going to talk about those again, but if you want to have a look at those, pause your video and keep moving. And similarly for this one, I've already talked about this for criterion 3, so I'm not going to spend any more time on it now, but certainly it's all fair game in asking this question under criterion 4. So what I've got here is based on question 20 2017, but these are my creative predictions. Okay, I've tried to predict what potential questions there might be, using the guidelines I've just outlined to you. So let's just have a go at this. So this one, 2 policy options that the government could take to combat rising inflation and inequalities. So in terms of government spending, they increase welfare spending, employment assistance programs, New Start for the people unemployed, community-based programs, health spending, and other subsidies. So there's a whole range of things you could talk about there, but you need to realise that as part of your fiscal policy. Also, in relation to the fiscal outcome, they can decrease taxes, offer rebates for low-income earners or disadvantaged people in regional areas, those sorts of things. So that will combat the rising prices, especially in relation to power, housing, and so on. They could change the income tax brackets to make the progressive taxation system more progressive to help the people in lower incomes as well. The next question, The possible benefits to reduce inequalities in the Australian community. So this is what I said before about the benefits. So it would increase their well-being, their confidence, and so forth, standard of living, better health outcomes, and hopefully less crime. The last question, the practical limitation to solving inequalities in our community based on rising inflation and poverty in Australia. So this comes down to the government, the willingness and ability to provide support services for low-income earners, disadvantaged people. It also depends on which government is in power at the time. You'd expect more sympathy from a socialist or social left-leaning government rather than a more right-of-centre government like the current coalition. All right. That's not to say that they won't be willing and able, but these are more social-oriented policies, and therefore we expect the Labor Party to be more sympathetic for this. The funding for these welfare programs are very expensive, so the governments need to find the source of funding. So if a government or if a opposition party is going to say we want to have more welfare services, increase funding to health and so on, that money's got to come from somewhere. So they can either cut another program, or more practically they might increase taxes. So therefore a socialist government would tend to tax more than a conservative government. Another problem in relation to housing prices has been the level of foreign investment, which has increased the housing prices and therefore rents in Australia. So that's something that's come from externally, and it's a practical limitation the current government has got to try and do something about high prices and high rents. Entrenched poverty and homelessness are difficult to solve, and it needs time. I mean, these problems have been around forever. Currently, the level of homelessness particularly is going up, and it's becoming an increasing problem. So as people get more disenfranchised, and people are getting more desperate, I suppose, on a political scale they might then vote for somebody else, but it makes it then more difficult to get people out of the situation, even if the government is willing and able to do so. All right. So there's some guide for the second part of question 20. Time will tell whether my guesses have been successful. It's difficult to predict what the examiner might say, but I've taken that information straight from the exam specifications, the standards for criterion 3 and 4. So I'd have to say that mine is an educated guess, but you just have to do the best you can. Alright, thanks for listening, and hopefully that it will be useful to you, and best of luck. I've got my fingers crossed.